and ask the question directly to the speaker. Okay. Well, thank you again and welcome.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you very much for the intro, Julio. So yeah, today I'll tell you about my paper, which deals with this question: does identity affect labor supply? So let me first tell you what I mean by identity. So identity here refers to individuals' concept of who they are. So in a seminar paper, Eckloff and Cranton described this idea that identity is oriented around social categories, for example, men, women, students, teachers. And these categories are associated with different behavior prescriptions. And violating such prescriptions can lead to emotional or psychological costs. So someone may follow her internal rules of behavior even when no one can see her, and when it is costly to follow these rules because of these psychological costs. And this way, identity can affect a host of economic outcomes, including how people vote, or how much money people are willing to donate, or what kind of foods people are willing to consume. So this idea of identity is different from social image, which refers to how one is perceived by other people. And in this project, I'm going to try to disentangle this effect of identity from that of social image. So this idea of identity has been central to much of social psychology. And yet the literature on identity is quite nascent in economics. So now there are a number of identity theories. So in these papers, people espouse the importance of considering identity effects in terms of economic decision making. And there are some rigorous.
I'm sorry, Suanna. Just a quick clarification question. What is the difference between identity and self-image?
So I'm thinking of them very similarly. So
okay.
Yeah. So I'm
okay. Thanks. That's good.
No problem. Yeah. So in other studies, sometimes they refer to identity as self-image. So there are some rigorous explorations of identity effects in the laboratory settings, and in this literature, priming techniques of reminding people about what their identity is has been kind of an important strategy. And there are also a number of empirical studies on identity, and here I'm showing some papers that have studied identity adoption in India. So, but one important outcome that economists care about is occupational choice and labor supply. And identity may be also very important for these outcomes. So the idea is that people may avoid desirable job opportunities because they evoke concerns about upholding their identity.
Suanna, a quick question. So if I was exploring corporate social responsibility, and I thought about a firm using corporate social responsibility to attract or engage its workers, mm-hmm. Would this be an idea about that I should think about in terms of identity or self-image?
Yes. So how I'm visualizing is that if you're part of this firm, so you have you have this notion of let's say it's it's Apple, and then as an Apple employee, you have this idea that as an Apple employee, I ought to behave in a certain way. So you have this behavior rule that you associate with this identity and your attachment to this rule. So if you incur any psychological or internal cost from violating this rule, then I would say you have identity concerns.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about it from a firm perspective on the supply side. A corporate image might be viewed as a workplace amenity. And if I have CSR as my corporate image, people who identify with that's a good match for them, they might want to select in and would accept a lower wage for that workplace amenity. I'm just trying to think about how a corporation, because there is work that does this. In fact, that's why I bring it up. I'm trying to figure out how that literature fits in when it's sort of understanding that there's an index of workplace amenities, and the corporation advertises those in part because people have their own identities and there's a meaning of work, or they want to identify with a potential employer, and then they sort in. So you have not only sorting, but you also have maybe on the intensive margin, they might work harder because they identify more with that firm. Is that how I should, that's my model of what I think is going on. And I'm just wondering if that's what your model is as well.
So I think it's related, although I focus less on whether, you know, their own behavior rules match this identity better. I guess you could think of interpret my effect in that sense as well. So I think in the theories you could maximize your utility by like minimizing, you know, yourself, your own characteristics and the distance from that sort of what the firm has in mind for the characteristics of their employees. So I think that, you know, I think that kind of model could also embed what I find in this project as well. But
Super,
yeah, I think the exact framework I have in mind will be a little bit clearer as you discuss.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And I'm not sure if I should keep mind of the chat, but please feel free to jump in because it's a little bit hard for me to see the chat. Okay. But the challenge of like studying this with observational data is that when a social group likes goes into prefers certain occupations, usually this group differs from other groups in many ways. So we'd be worried about like group differences in education or, you know, other opportunities, and we'd be worried about these compounding effects. And it's also often difficult to, you know, randomize what people have as their deeply ingrained identities. So I address these challenges by running a field experiment that exploits some unique features of the Indian caste system. And I argue that I provide the first test of how identity affects job-specific labor supply. So to do this, I first run some surveys on the associations between castes and simple manual tasks, and to establish the ranking of these caste groups in the setting. And then I run my job take-up experiment. So in this experiment, casual laborers who are belonging to different castes decide whether to take up various one-day job offers. And then all of these offers involve working on a default manufacturing task and one additional task. And this additional task may be associated with a specific caste. And so these offers are only changing in two dimensions: what this additional task is and what is the share of the total time that the workers are required to spend on the task. Okay. So what this design allows me to do is to separate the cost of working on a task into two parts. So the idea is that there is a fixed utility cost of engaging in any kind of task. So here I'm just plotting a hypothetical figure to illustrate this idea. So here I'm plotting the take-up rate of an offer against the time that the workers spend on the additional task in minutes. And by looking at how take-up rate changes with the longer time that the worker has to spend on the additional task, I can see how much of the take-up rate changes due to the variable cost of spending longer time on the task. And if the default take-up rate is 1, then I can see what is the discrete fall in take-up rate is due to the fixed cost of spending any time at all on this task. And the argument is that this fixed cost is highly likely to be influenced by caste identity concerns. So the concerns about spending, so working on a task at all that sort of conflicts with your identity. And then with some assumptions, we'll be able to say how much of this fixed cost is attributable to caste identity concerns and other. Yes.
Suanna? Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So one question is, how are you able to distinguish the identity here with perhaps social pressure? For example, that you may not take the job, perhaps you want to take it, you don't care, it is not in contrast with your identity, but you are not going to take it because of social pressure that, again, we all agree that this is the wrong thing to do in some sense, but you may not.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, perhaps, yeah.
No. Yes. So this was also something that I wanted to look at. So what I do is that, all these extra tasks, they are only performed in a private space. So no one other than the employer can actually see them perform this task. So that's the same for everyone. And then I randomize whether other people will learn about their decision or not. So in the private condition, I reassure them however they decide regarding these offers will not be discussed with anyone. But in the public condition, I tell them all their decisions will be discussed with their neighbors. So that's how I work on it, and then we'll see the results on that.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, please feel free to jump in as well with other questions. So let me quickly preview my results before going into the details of the study. So what I do is that I have a number of tasks in the experiment. So I have some tasks which I call identity tasks, and these are the tasks that have associations with specific caste groups. So for example, washing clothes is strongly associated with the Doba caste in this setting. And then I pair these up with control tasks. So for example, washing clothes is paired up with washing tools. So while both tasks involve washing objects with soap and water, no one associates washing tools with any specific caste group, while washing clothes is strongly associated with the Doba caste. So what I do is I call both of these tasks to be same ranked as the Doba caste. And depending on how the worker's caste ranks against the Doba caste, I call both of these tasks higher tasks or lower tasks. And so this allows me to run a sort of a different regression with the identity task dummy interacted with these ranking dummies as well. So we can actually see the results with these simple graphs. So here I'm plotting the actual take-up rates against the time that workers spend in minutes. And then we see that when the tasks are considered same ranked, on average, the take-up rates for identity tasks are very similar to the take-up rates for control tasks. But when the tasks are considered higher, there's this like parallel gap between the take-up rates between identity tasks and pair control tasks. So even when these tasks, identity tasks are associated with caste that are considered to rank higher than their own, the workers seem to dislike spending time on these tasks. And then when the tasks are considered lower, as you may expect, this gap in take-up rate increases even more. And you can see that while take-up rates seem to fall a little bit with the longer time that the workers spend on these tasks, actually these falls are actually quite similar across different tasks and are pretty small, while these vertical gaps are very large. So this suggests that the cost of spending, the spending longer time on this task is actually not very large, whereas these concerns about spending any time at all on these tasks are really what's driving the differences in this take-up behavior.
Excuse me, Susanna.
Yeah.
Could you clarify again what are we seeing in the left-hand side graph?
So with the control tasks, it seems that the take-up rates are not changing, not that different across these same ranked tasks or higher tasks or lower tasks. Actually, for higher tasks, it's a little bit higher, although these are not like very statistically significant. Whereas for the identity task, it seems to matter a lot whether these tasks are associated with higher or lower caste groups.
Thank you.
No problem. So when we look at the regression results, the results are very similar to what you can eyeball from the graphs. So the gap in take-up rate is 23 percentage points for higher tasks and 47 percentage points for lower tasks. And as we briefly discussed, I randomize whether these decisions are known to other people or not. And I actually find that the effects are very similar across these different conditions. So this seems to suggest that the workers are driven by concerns about their identity, and then giving workers additional concerns about their social image actually has very little additional effect on the take-up rate behavior. And there are some caveats to this interpretation, so I will definitely go into that later when I discuss these results in more detail.
So Suanna, just a quick question before you get into the mediator here. If I thought about a compensating differential,
Mhm.
what would the compensating differential be in this market for identity?
So what do you mean, like how much wage would they demand for working in identity conflicting jobs? Is that the question?
That's what a compensating differential is, correct?
Yeah. So in the main experiment, I cannot answer that very well, given that the wages are always the same with across all the different offers. And I actually try to answer that more directly in the supplementary experiment. So here, what I'm doing is I'm giving people bonus wage if they agree to work on these tasks, and I have a price list of how much that bonus wage may be if they agree to the offer. And then what I find is that a lot of people refuse to work on these tasks even for 10 minutes, even when I offer them very large wage, so 10 times their daily wage. And one interesting finding that I get out of this is that this compensating differential that's demanded is very has a bimodal distribution. So some people demand a lot of wage for working on these identity conflicting tasks, whereas the people who are willing to work on these tasks demand very little wage. So I think that's kind of a new finding, given that in a lot of the models that we have, we have been assuming that a certain social group will have this amount of or higher compensating differential for certain kinds of jobs. But what I'm finding here is that even within the same group, they seem to have very extremely different responses.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense of, so if there's enough heterogeneity in job types and people types, then these kinds of preferences can have zero impact on any market equilibrium. But I'm just trying to get a sense of, so I'm perfectly ready to agree with you that identity matters, and it's a workplace amenity. What the match is. I think about this as a match. My preference is with what the firm represents. It's a match. And that's something I trade off with wage and other workplace amenities. I'm just trying to get a sense of whether you believe your results are going to be big enough to affect an equilibrium wage or allocation of people across jobs. I'm having a hard time reading what you're trying to say. You're putting very big numbers up, and now you're saying 43% of workers have like lexicographic type preferences, but just sort of what do you think about, if I scale this up, how important is this going to be in our economy?
Yes, I think this is a tough question to answer based on the experimental findings. I'm working with very specific caste groups, and I'm working with very specific tasks. And I think it is, while the numbers are large, I think it is hard to generalize this to the whole market. And I think, so there's a concurrent paper by Kastan, Keniston, and Kleinberg, which hopefully I'll have time to discuss a little bit at the end. And for them, what they're trying to do is use a rowing model framework to actually think about how much of identity concerns could be important for allocation workers in India. And I think that is important to have a different approach as well when we want to say something about the aggregate market. And I think what could be really, what I see as the contribution of my paper is, first, just like having, very, like even with this, in this unique setting, I think it is not straightforward to provide evidence that identity matters. But I think it also teaches us something about how we should think about these models. So when we take this approach of using a structural model to estimate worker firm match, we often use it. We do not focus so much on the heterogeneity within the same group. We tend to assume that this group has this similar kind of demand preference for these jobs. But what I'm finding with this experiment is that some people will have very elastic labor supply to wages, while some people in the same group will have very inelastic labor supply. And I think just understanding people's preference better using an experiment like this can actually help us write down a better model for characterizing the overall labor market.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, really the question is, so if you look at the data, no, if you run a hedonic wage regression, let's say, so in India, do we observe a wage gap for the same occupation across caste or not?
Yes, we do. So in this other paper, they do find that the people who stay in their traditional caste-based occupation earn lower wages compared to the people of other people from their caste who are engaged in other kinds of occupations. So it seems that they may be willing to take lower wages because they are engaged in their caste-specific occupation. But I think another thing that they find is that if you look within occupation, the people whose own caste is directly associated with the occupation are getting higher wages than other people who move into their occupation. So it seems that they're, because they are engaging in the occupation where their friends are also engaged in, or their fathers are also engaged, then maybe they do have higher productivity compared to the other people who move into their own occupations. So I think, yeah, does this answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I think that brings me to discussing a little bit about the literature. So there's this large literature on occupational choice, and a lot of these, while many of these papers don't consider identity effects directly, there are a number of theoretical studies in economics really espouse the importance of considering identity effects, and they also emphasize how identity could be important for occupational choice. And then we also discussed these papers a little bit. So there is a literature on how talent is distributed across occupations. So there's this paper by Xie et al. That look at how different groups in the US, such as Black female workers and Black male workers and white male workers, how these groups are distributed across occupations, have been converging over time, and how much of that has contributed to increase in aggregate productivity. And this paper that I keep mentioning by Kassan et al. Actually uses a similar framework, but they are looking, the goal is to actually incorporate these identity concerns in India into thinking about the Indian labor market. So I think I view my paper as providing sort of a supplementary evidence on first, first-hand evidence that we should be convinced that identity actually matters in this labor market, and we should think about this when we are looking at how workers are distributed across occupations. But I think it can also help inform, writing down the model that actually fits with what workers have, what workers' preferences. And lastly, I think the project relates to the broad literature on the impact of culture and social contexts on decision making. And especially this paper is closely related to other experimental studies on social image in the labor market. And my paper develops an experimental method which I argue actually can capture identity effects in the labor market setting. Okay, so any other question before I sort of go into the details of the study? Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit about the theories of identity and the simple framework that I have for the project. So while there's like a huge literature on identity from sociology and psychology, I'm not going to be able to do justice to the whole literature. I'm mainly importing two very fundamental ideas for running my experiment. So the first idea is that the people who belong to a social group are often averse to adopting the characteristics and practices of other groups. And this may be particularly so if the other groups have lower social status than them. So this idea suggests that I should test for identity effects in a labor market where groups are strongly associated with specific jobs, and then where also these groups form a distinctive social hierarchy so that I can see how these relative status could matter. And the second idea that's important to my project is that people are averse to violating their internal rules of behavior. So it's not just that they dislike the time that they're spending doing something that's inconsistent with their rules. The fact that whether the rule has been broken or not can actually influence a lot their behavior. Like it could have a large effect on their utility. So this idea suggests that I should test whether workers avoid spending even a small amount of time on an identity inconsistent job. So here is a simple framework that relates to this experiment. So it's not a general framework, but it actually considers the specific job take-up problem for worker I, who's sort of facing the decision in my experiment. So this worker I belongs to social category CI. So you can think of this CI as caste of worker I. And this worker would consider whether to take up a one-day job that offers wage W and total working time T. And then this worker will spend some working time TJ on a default task J and spend the rest of the time TK on the additional task K. And this task K may be associated with a different category. Okay. So this is how the worker's utility can be described. It has the standard components such as utility from wage and utility from leisure, and these components actually will not change across the different job offers. And the worker incurs costs from working on the task. So for each task that the worker works on, there's a variable utility cost of working on the task and the fixed utility cost of working on the task. So the variable utility cost depends on the time spent on this task, whereas the fixed utility cost gets incurred as soon as the worker spends any time at all on the task and doesn't actually depend on the time in other way. So one assumption that we need is that any variable cost is continuous in the time spent on the task and equals 0 when the worker does not spend any time on the task. So the idea is that if I don't spend any time washing clothes, then obviously the utility cost of variable utility cost of washing clothes is 0. But if I spend very little time washing clothes, then the variable utility cost of washing clothes would also be very close to 0. So one functional form that satisfies this assumption is a linear function of time. And while I test the other functional forms, like as you have already seen in the graph, this is actually a rather good approximation of how variable utility cost works for the tasks that are involved in my experiment.
So, sorry, Susanna, one question. The time spent on the task is endogenous or is exogenous, in the sense that if I'm,
Yeah, it's exogenous because the offers would differ in the time that the worker has to spend on the task, and in the end, only one offer is randomly selected for the worker.
So it's not you have to clean so many pieces of clothes, is you have to be cleaning clothes for so much time.
Yeah, that's how it is in the experiment.
Thank you.
So I can ask you a thing on this. Is how much experience I have in washing clothes gonna matter for you, like for my cost of effort of washing clothes?
Yes. So that would influence both this FK and VK, I think. So you can think of it that way. So here I'm looking at the fixed cost and variable cost in more detail. And there are these components that are not dependent on the worker's caste. So for example, it could depend on the worker's experience. If you don't have experience with it, maybe the variable cost, like working on washing clothes, is very unpleasant for you. And this could also matter for the fixed cost. For instance, if you're just averse to having new experience, right? So if you've never washed clothes before, maybe you have a aversion to trying washing clothes for the first time, and that will be reflected in this small effort. And then there are these other components that are dependent on the worker's social category. So ID is an indicator that the task is associated with a different social category, and IL is indicator that task K is associated with a lower social category. And the idea is that from the theory, it says that identity concerns are expected to have very large effect on the fixed utility cost of working on task K. So actually what I'm doing in the experiment is not getting the total cost of working on an identity inconsistent task. It's really looking only at, what, first I only focus on the fixed cost because that's more plausibly attributable to identity concerns. And then I also separate what would be attributable to the caste identity concerns specifically. So
Suanna, just a quick question. How does wage change through time?
So it's not changing in the main experiment. So while the total working time is fixed, and then I'm varying how long they have to spend on this task, and yet the wage they get for that job offer is always fixed. So you just get flat wage of 3,300 rupees for that day's work.
So what you're doing is you're saying you're going to work for a day, and I'm going to allocate you into different tasks for a set period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so if I say no to you, then I'm not doing this task, but I'm doing a different task that you tell me about, or that's just unknown when I'm making my choice?
Right. So in the experiment, what they do is that, like they see different offers, but for each offer, they only decide whether they are willing to do it or not do it. So
right, but if I don't do it, I earn the same wage, but do I know what task I'll be doing?
No, so if you say no, and then that offer is randomly selected and given to you, then you don't get any job.
Oh, you don't get a job?
Yeah, so you are always looking at your outside option versus the offer at hand.
Okay, but that's what I was asking about timing. So let's say I'm in a time condition that's an hour versus 2 hours. Is my wage double in the 2 hours, or is it the same as the hour?
It's same as, just the spending 1 hour on the extra tasks.
Yeah. So now I'm confused about how you can get variable cost, because if it's a longer period of time, then it's a lower wage per unit of time, plus it's part of your model of being a negative utility.
Sorry, so the total time is always fixed. So the total working time is not increasing. So it's fixed at 5 hours, but you may be spending half an hour on washing clothes or 1 hour on washing clothes, right?
Right, but what do you do in the other half hour if you do a half hour washing clothes? What job are you doing for that half hour?
So you are making paper bags. So you're working on the default task. So here,
yeah, that's what I was asking about. So but now you're making an assumption about the disutility of that task compared to the other half hour, and I'm making some functional form assumption now to make my interpretation. That's what I'm trying to get to. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's right. So it is true that the difference between the utility cost of working on paperback, the default task, versus the cost of working on this extra task, right? And so that difference is changing with time, and yet the wage is being held fixed. So the fall in take-up rate will be, the workers will reduce their take-up rates if the utility cost of washing clothes compared to this default task is greater, and you are increasing that time. So
okay, thanks.
Yeah, so you could try to back out, what is the wage you could impute what kind of wage that you'd need because of this differences in costs as well. But that's not what I try to do.
Yeah, that's a compensating differential that I was asking about before, Suanna. So you do have the variation to get that.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, so
you don't need necessarily wage variation given your model, but anyway, that's
true. Yeah. But these variable cost responses are pretty flat, and I just directly try to do that with the supplementary experiment. Okay, so So how do we test whether these beta parameters are positive? First, I look at responses to job offers that involve spending a very short time on these additional tasks. So then the difference in offer take-up rate is attributable to the fixed cost. And then we can determine whether beta is positive by comparing worker responses to job offers. So in an ideal world, you could just have one worker and then two similar tasks so that the small fixed cost is the same. So if there's washing clothes that violates my identity and then washing clothes that doesn't violate my identity, all you need to do is look at my response to these two offers to see if I have an identity constraints, right? But in the real world, it's hard to find two exactly same tasks where only one violates my identity. And similarly, another way is to have very similar two workers and only one worker has concerns about a specific task, but it's also hard to find two such workers. So the approach that I take is like comparing across two groups, across two tasks. So if only one task is inconsistent with group A's identity, then I just need sort of this general assumption in order to make this different kind of comparison. So, the assumption that we need is like in a world without identity concerns. So, if beta was always 0, then the probability that a random worker in group A is willing to accept the offer involving the default task and yet decline the offer with identity conflicting task is weakly smaller than the analogous probability for the other group, right? So if this assumption holds, then I can see how one group of workers views the identity task compared to control tasks and compare that against how another group responds to these two tasks. And then that will give us a lower bound on the share of workers that have this beta parameter greater than 0. Okay, any question? So given in the interest of time, let me move on a little bit quickly. So, another thing is that we can also think about social image costs. So here, while working on identity inconsistent jobs can lead to social image concerns of many kinds, what I'm focusing on is like the cost of merely being perceived as the type to willingly violate these caste norms. And to do that, I can randomly vary the observability of worker decisions to separate just the effect of this specific image concern. So that's what I will do in the experiment. Okay, so now let me tell you about the experimental setting a little bit. So there's the historical caste system in India. And then traditionally there were these 4 hierarchical classes or varnas, and this is all reflected in today's political system. So there are these 3 groups that are officially recognized by the Indian government for their historical disadvantage. And these groups are further divided into 4,000 jatis or castes. And then these castes and caste networks are still very influential in Indian life today. And there are 2 features of this caste system that's important. One is that they form a social hierarchy. And then the second is that they provide links to very specific occupations and tasks. So I run 2 surveys, first to document which caste group is associated with which task, and also to see what are people's personal prior experiences with the tasks are. And then I select 7 groups for the ranking survey for the experiment. And in the ranking survey, I ask people to rank these 7 groups. So all of the 7, so these 7 castes belong to scheduled caste and OBC caste. So I'm sort of selecting caste groups that are sort of comparable in terms of their regular general wealth and education. I'm not including the Brahmin caste, for instance, who are very, like have a very high social power in the setting. I'm actually using a group that's sort of all recognized for their historical disadvantage. Okay, so to show you the results from the survey, so I have these 7 groups, and this is the average rank score that's assigned to each group. So we have the Kaibarta caste as being ranked the highest in the sample, and Hari caste as being ranked the lowest. And then according to the first survey, we find that washing clothes is strongly associated with the Doba caste. So 72% of workers associate washing clothes with the Doba caste, whereas no one associates washing farming tools with any scheduled caste. And similarly for other tasks, for instance, mending grass mats, only 15% associate with any scheduled caste, but the answers vary widely. And then no one associates mending grass mats with the mochi caste, whereas 98% associate mending leather shoes with the mochi caste. And finally, sweeping latrines is associated with the hari caste, whereas sweeping animal sheds is not associated with any scheduled caste. So based on this table, I categorize tasks as being same ranked. So for mochi caste, these two tasks are considered same, whereas these two tasks are considered higher, whereas these two tasks are considered lower. And based on this, I can run a diff style regression with interactions of dummies for different tasks interacted with dummies for identity tasks. And then I can include linear controls for task linear time controls for each task, and then also include task fix effect and worker fix effect. So one question
about the caste system, like how much dislike there is between these three castes that you focus on? Because I would have expected, like, if there is a lot of dislike, which is my prior, then you would have also a lot of horizontal sort of discrimination between them, so that, like, if I'm caste that only washes clothes, I wouldn't want to do anything else, even if it's like from a higher caste or something.
Yeah, I think that's what I find. I feel like I missed your question.
So first I was asking about the setting, how much animosity and distaste there is between these three that you focused on, whether they dislike each other. And if they do, I would have expected, like, horizontal discrimination to be more relevant than vertical, which seems to be.
So here all tasks are done individually, and workers actually have, pretty separate workstations, so they just work on their own spots. And I think because they know that the work site is the same, like whether what they expect to be the composition at the work site is not changing across the offers. So that way I'm trying to fix the component where if you don't want to work with certain caste groups, that wouldn't play a role in the experimental decision.
Oh, I see. So that was a version of the answer that I didn't think about. So no, but like what I was getting at is, do you know that these castes dislike each other to a point where I wouldn't want to do a job from any other caste that is not mine because I really dislike them?
Yeah. So I don't think
I don't have to interact with them. That's fine.
Yeah. So I don't think they dislike each other, but it is definitely true that they don't want to work on any jobs that are associated with other castes. And that was part of the reason, is that was the historical rule. You are not supposed to move up or down. You are not supposed to work in any jobs that are associated with other castes. And I think that's also just broadly consistent with the identity theory, where you sort of don't want to work in jobs that are strongly associated with other groups as well. Yeah, but I'm not sure how much of that is driven by pure dislikes. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, so one thing that we should check, especially because, okay, I really don't have much time, but one thing we should check is like looking at, how much personal experience levels that workers have with these tasks. So, the experience level vary quite a bit depending on what the tasks are. But one thing that we can look at is like how the experience level differ across caste groups, depending on whether it's an identity task or not. So what I find is that the workers, whether workers have experiences of ever performing the task or whether they've performed it without wage, actually that's statistically different across castes. So if you sort of think that, what should matter for this decision is like whether you've done the task at all in general, then I think we can still believe that, just spending 10 minutes on these tasks, it shouldn't depend that much on like, then we should be able to compare across groups, even higher versus same or higher versus lower. But what I do find is that the experience of performing the task for wage does differ across caste groups. So if your own caste is directly associated with the task, this is what identity here says, then then you are more likely to have performed the task for a wage. So if you believe that, this kind of particular experience could be very important for the decision during the experiment, then this will be an overestimate of the identity effects. And therefore, but what we do still find is that, whether the workers rank higher than DOVA or lower than DOVA, this doesn't seem to matter even for the experience of doing it for wage. So then if you believe that, then I think, this looking at this coefficient, that will provide the lower bound on what the identity affects, how the concerns about identity is driving the take-up decisions. Okay, I'm not sure if I explained that super well, but happy to talk more after I show you some results. Okay, so in the experiment, I have these male household heads of ages 18 to 55, and then
Suanna,
all of the
you can take more minutes if you need. So
sorry.
You can take more minutes after the
Okay.
report. Yeah.
Okay, so, thank you. So, so these workers, I recruit workers who are primarily driving income from their daily wage labor. And then in this setting, employers typically come to the village to offer jobs at prevailing wage. So what they do is they describe a job and then they offer it at a prevailing wage rate. So what I do is I try to do a very similar thing. So I try to mimic this process so that what they see is an offer that's offered at the same prevailing daily wage rate. If the workers don't like, usually, they can say no, and then the employer just goes to find other workers. So that's sort of, I'm hoping I try to make the decision process similar to what they face day to day. So I only recruit workers who express potential interest in a one-day job of producing paper bags. So presumably these workers are all willing to take up the job, the default job of only working on paper bags for 5 hours. So I'm working with 630 workers who belong to those 7 caste groups. So this is how the experiment proceeded. So first, I did a practice choice exercise, so just so that they understand sort of this BDM-like procedure. So what they were doing is they saw these different offers to purchase packages of food and sugar. And then regarding each offer, they would choose whether they would want to accept or decline each offer at the same price. And at the very end, only one offer will be randomly selected and that will be implemented according to what they said regarding that specific offer. So this was to help them sort of understand this like random offer process. And then so in the main component, in the main job take-up exercise, they saw a bunch of offers that all offered the same wage of 300 rupees and the same total working time of 5 hours and the same employer and the work site. And all of the offers involved making paper bags and one extra task. And then this extra task would change, and also the time requirement on the task would change across offers. And as we noted, this extra task was always performed in a private space. And then in addition to having this BDM-like procedure, I also asked workers, please think about each offer as if it's a single take it or leave it offer, and just give a simple, honest answer about whether you'd like to work on this job or just decline this job. And just so that it'd be very clear to them what all we want is just a simple, honest answer about whether they want to do this job. So this is like part of the sheet they saw. So here each cell is representing the offer.
Hi, Suanna. I hate to get all behavioral on you.
Yeah.
But like a psychologist or a person who believed in like the literal interpretation of a warm glow model, would say that each time they can answer those questions in a way that shows their identity, it's like showing to themselves, that they get utility from that expression itself. And if that model's true, then your design really isn't the right one to get at the question, because it's really picking up this utility from expressing preferences, whether it's a signal to self about the identity or to others. It's a way to express multiple times, but they don't carry with it the cost. So you kind of get utility for free and you attach a small probability of it being real. This is like the pay one or pay all independence axiom assumption, that Holt wrote about in '86 and Starmer and Sutton did work on. But if you believe those kinds of models, the independence axiom certainly won't hold. And like this would be the wrong altogether experimental approach to take. So given you seem super thoughtful, I wonder why you took this approach.
Yeah, no, I think this is actually a great point, and something I should lay out more carefully in the paper. So I totally agree. I think if they derive utility from expressing once for each answer, then so I like to. So one thing that I think I could do is sort of aggregate over these probabilities, and then by declining if they decided that because of each offer doesn't have a high probability, by expressing for each of these offers against the identity tasks, them declining how much money that they're leaving on the table. I think that's maybe one estimate that they could provide in case this is the right model that we should have in mind. And I'd love to hear your suggestion on how, if I can address this a little bit better given the data. But the main reason I did it this way is like, first I wanted to sort of hold fixed the worker and then see their responses within the worker against these different treatments. So I think a different design would have been also involved a larger sample, and then I would ask, given each person just one offer, and I personally think the results would have been very similar, even if I implemented that design where just one worker is one offer. But given the time and budget constraint, this was also a more practical choice as well.
I see. Okay, thanks. So that was a lot, but I'll just pick out your last passage. So you really have within data. So you can give us the full distribution because you have the full joint distribution now rather than marginal distributions, but all you've been presenting so far have been marginal distributions. So you should probably give us a full joint distribution treatment effects, right? If that's why you did it, I would suspect that you want to give us a full joint distribution.
Okay. I'm not so sure if I understand what you mean by presenting the full.
You have a within design, right? So each person's answering multiple questions. So now I'm getting the counterfactual of John and John here, John there, John there. Usually we do between designs, which give us a marginal distribution, but you have the full joint distribution now because I have the counterfactual of each person. So now I can give the full joint distribution of treatment effects.
Yeah. So
but you haven't shown us anything. You do all between so far. You've given us all marginal distribution.
So,
and I just wonder why you're doing that. If you said, look, I did this within, but then you're not showing us the value of your within design.
So I do when I don't run the regressions, I do control for worker fixed effects. So it does.
No, I'm not talking about controlling. I'm talking about you can give the full distribution of treatment effects.
I see.
You so far all of your answers have been average treatment effects.
Mm-hmm.
That's a marginal result, right? You're saying I got some people in one group and some people in another group, but if you have within design, I can get the full joint distribution, right?
Yeah.
That's like the beauty behind a within design. The trade-off is people don't believe within designs, but we don't have to. I can send you some stuff afterwards. It's no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, and so workers also, so during this procedure, workers also see photos of these books, so they have a good sense of what the tasks are like. And one thing to note is that for mending shoes and mending breast milks, workers don't have much experiences with them. So I also told them they don't have to have any experience. They will be assisting an experienced trainer with the tasks. Okay, and then after workers indicate all of their decisions, one job offer is randomly selected and implemented according to workers' choice over the next few days. And then I conduct the follow-up surveys with the workers. And then finally, I conduct some focus group discussions, but this was only used for randomizing the privacy condition. Okay, so we've seen this graph before. So what I find is that, the workers are less likely to take up offers that are associated with different higher tasks. The take-up rate falls by 23 percentage points, but when the tasks are considered lower, it falls by additional 24 percentage points. And I also look at the results by caste sensitivity. So actually, let me skip this part and then talk first about the social image part. So to see if some of these responses to jobs were driven by concerns about social image, I randomized workers into two conditions at the village level. So all workers heard about these focus group sessions that will happen in their villages with other neighbors. But in the private condition, workers were told that their choices will not be discussed with anyone except for their willingness to wash agricultural tools. And this was because the focus group would be about agricultural practices. But in the public condition, they were told that their choices will be discussed during the focus group sessions and regardless of their participation. So in this case, their decisions will be known to their neighbors with certainty. And what I find is that the results are very different for across these two treatment conditions. So if social image concerns were driving the take-up decisions, we'd find that these coefficients are negative and significant, but we actually don't see that. And so this suggests that the results, I think these results suggest that the effects are mainly driven by concerns about identity rather than social image. So this is not to say that the social image concerns don't exist. It seems more that workers may have already strong identity concerns, and this could be very highly correlated with which workers have social image concerns, so that imposing social image concerns on top of the identity concerns seem to have little additional effect on take-up. But by the nature of my design, this cannot completely rule out social image concerns. So for example, the workers may face some concerns about whether the privacy will be protected, or they may expect some cost of lying to others if others were asking them how they should respond towards these different jobs. And it is also true that the surveyor or the employer knows what the worker decides, so there could be some social image concerns towards the surveyor. However, the reason I put forward my interpretation that identity concerns are driving the results is that there are a few reasons. So one is that another study on social image effect in the same setting, they use a similar privacy variation technique, and here they actually find statistically significant differences across the conditions. But this suggests that this technique should at least have some power to vary expectations about privacy, and yet I'm finding very similar results across these two conditions. And also the proposed interpretation seems more consistent with survey answers. So in the follow-up survey, I directly asked workers why they turned down certain job offers. And I find that a lot of workers state reasons that are reminiscent of identity, such as this work is for lower caste, or I feel shame even if no one finds out about it. I feel shaming myself. And actually a quarter of workers cite reasons that are related to both identity and social image, but very few workers seem to cite reasons that are only relating to social image. And also from the separate survey that I did, I also had some vignette questions describing characters that are violating caste norms. And then here I also randomized the sample. So, some people would be asked about their own personal opinion about such characters, whereas other people were asked to think about what other neighbors or family how they would judge these characters. And I find that for each of these scenarios regarding caste norm violations, the answers are actually very similar, regardless whether it's phrased in terms of their own opinion or other people's opinion. So this seems to suggest that at least in this setting, maybe perhaps the internal rules that they have is very similar to sort of what kind of rules that other people impose on them, and that might be the reason why I don't find strong social image effects. in the paper, I discuss a number of alternate explanations. So one thing I do is I try to control for the differences in worker education and wealth. I find very similar results, and then I also perform a number of robustness checks, controlling for alternate time frames or controlling for order or set dependence effect. But now let me talk quickly a little bit about the supplementary experiment. So one question I had is that, so in the main experiment shows that the workers are willing to forego one-day job opportunity, where, in this lean season, it is actually kind of hard to find regular jobs for these workers. They only find about 2 to 3 days of work in the week prior to the experiment. So while this job is valuable, I think the question is, if the workers were paid additional wage, would they be willing to abandon their concerns about identity and actually engage in these tasks? So in the supplementary experiment, I actually had a much smaller sample, only involving 2 caste groups. And so here, what I really wanted to see is that we already know that these caste groups, some of them are going to be turning down the regular job offers, but if the wage was much higher, could I be able to get most of them engaging in this task? So here these workers actually got started first on a 1-day paper bag manufacturing job that paid 300 rupees. And then they were given surprise offers to switch to working on another task for part of the remaining working time. And then if they could switch for a bonus wage, and if they agreed to switch and this offer was selected, they would receive this bonus wage. And this bonus wage could be as small as 0 to 30 rupees, or it could be as large as 3,000 rupees. Any questions about the design? Okay. So here I'm plotting how much workers were demanding for switching for just 10 minutes on the different tasks. So what I find is that the distribution is pretty bimodal, both for identity tasks and payer control tasks. But there are a lot more workers were turning down the switching to working on another task for identity tasks. And the workers who are willing to switch, actually, many of them are willing to switch for even just 0 or 30 rupees. So it seems that the inherent cost, perhaps, of working on these tasks is not very large, and yet some workers would refuse to work on these tasks, even when they're offered very high wage, which really seems to suggest it's more about whether people care about violating their internal rule of behavior.
Sorry, can I ask a clarification?
Yeah.
So what explains the 20% of people that also reject incredibly high wages here? 15 maybe.
What happens to the people
no, here on the left panel, what explains 15-18% of people?
So a lot of that is driven by the task of sweeping animal sheds. So that's sweeping animal sheds is the pair control task for sweeping latrines. But sweeping animal sheds, a lot of people were still turning it down, saying that this is shameful. And they were saying this is kind of a poor people's job, and they wouldn't want to do this job. And so I think people still have some status concerns, even when this task is not associated with any caste identity. And I think the difference can be attributed to the caste identity concerns, but I think it's true that even other jobs that don't have caste associations could impose large cost of working on as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so now wrapping up, I want to just discuss some ideas and implications. So my results suggest that workers have a very strong aversion to violating their internal rules of behavior. And then so for some jobs, people's labor supply can be highly inelastic to wages. And I think another thing that I learned is that there is this existence of extreme types. So even within the same social group, it seems that some people care a lot about following these rules, while others do not care at all whether they work on tasks that are associated with other groups. So I think this leaves some open questions, such as like what causes some people to really adopt and adhere to certain behavior prescriptions while others don't, like what kind of experience can drive such extreme responses. And I think another interesting question that I am not able to answer today, but like hopefully in future research is like, what would happen if one actually violated this rule once? So at least some theoretical studies suggest that it could be, once you violate the rules, you may have very large negative emotional costs, but after that, maybe it gets easier to violate these rules again. And I think I think it'd be interesting to explore whether this is true, or you could even expect the opposite reaction. So I think that's something that could be interesting to explore in this setting where people seem to care a lot about these rules. And also, I think the results have some broad potential implications. One is distribution of talent across occupations. And so this paper by Kassan et al., they find that Indian male workers are still 3 times as likely to work in their traditional occupations compared to any other occupation. And I think, thinking about what this, how identity plays a role in driving this kind of behavior, I think that's quite interesting. And I think there could be other frictions in the society due to this preference as well. So it's well known that the caste groups are not evenly distributed across geographic regions. So you can imagine that in a region where certain caste groups are very prevalent, you may have more of certain service occupations associated with that caste available, and that could affect the market price and availability of services. But more generally, I think identity could be important in other settings where jobs are associated with specific social groups. So for example, in a lot of countries, the blue collar fields such as manufacturing are shrinking, and pink collar fields where women are often engaged in, such as nursing or taking care of children and elderly, are surging. And yet men are quite slow to move into these fields in many countries. And I think thinking about this with the identity lens could lead to some interesting policy implications, or teach us more about how the labor market behaviors can be changed. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to just stay on and discuss some of the parts that I didn't explain too well.
Great, thank you so much, Suanna. But I think that we have time for one question. If someone has other question. Okay, well, thank you again, Suanna, for the great presentation. And well, next Friday, we will have Rashid Lajah from Universidad de los Andes presenting about equality of opportunities and human capital accumulation, motivational effect of nationwide scholarship in Colombia. So I hope to have you all there. And well, thank you again, Suanna, and thank you all for attending the seminar.
Thank you very much.